Something is happening in Brussels that is going to change the Windows operating system on every machine inside the European Union. Not in a small way, not cosmetically. The European Commission, working with the data protection authorities of the member states, has finalized a series of regulatory directives that, starting in the second half of 2026, force Microsoft to strip out or disable by default roughly 24 telemetry and data collection mechanisms that have been shipping in Windows 10 and Windows 11 for years. This is not a rumor. This is not a leak. These are published directives with legal force, with compliance deadlines. And Microsoft has very quietly begun updating its European Windows builds to meet them, which means that, in a matter of months, European Windows users and American Windows users will be running what is effectively a different operating system. One of those versions will collect dramatically less data about its users. Guess which one? Let me explain what is actually in these directives, because the details matter more than the headlines suggest. The legal foundation is a combination of 3 overlapping frameworks. The General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which has been enforced since 2018, and which has been steadily sharpening its enforcement teeth. The Digital Markets Act, the DMA, which went into full effect in 2024 and which designates certain large platforms as gatekeepers, subject to additional obligations. And a newer instrument, the Digital Services Act, the DSA, which adds transparency and user control requirements on top. Microsoft, because of Windows market share and because of the bundled services that ship with it, is classified as a gatekeeper under the DMA. That classification is what has given regulators the legal authority to reach into the operating system itself and dictate how it behaves. The specific changes fall into 5 categories, and every one of them deserves attention. The first category is telemetry. Windows 10 introduced a telemetry architecture that collected, by default, a wide range of data about how users use their computers. Application launches, error reports, hardware configurations, usage patterns. Microsoft has always argued that this telemetry is necessary to improve the product and to detect security threats. European regulators have, for years, argued that the extent of the collection goes beyond what users are reasonably informed of, and beyond what can be justified by the stated purposes. The new directives require Microsoft to default the telemetry setting to its lowest level, called security in Microsoft's own documentation, which limits collection to critical bug reports and security telemetry. Users who want to send more can opt in. No user will be sending more by default. The second category is cloud integration. Windows 11, in particular, pushes users toward a Microsoft account during initial setup. On European machines, starting in late 2026, that push becomes formally a choice. The setup flow must present a local account option with equal visibility to the Microsoft account option. No dark patterns, no hidden menus, no fake error messages that make the local account path seem broken. Microsoft has been warned specifically about its past behavior in this area, where setup screens would loop users back to the Microsoft account prompt, even when they were trying to create a local account. Those patterns are now explicitly prohibited. The third category is advertising. Windows has, for years, shipped with an advertising ID, a unique identifier that apps and the operating system itself can use to track usage patterns for ad targeting purposes. On European machines, the advertising ID must now be off by default. Users can turn it on, but the default is off. Similarly, the start menu's suggested apps, the lock screen's sponsored content, and the notification center's promotional messages from Microsoft products must all be disabled by default. Microsoft is allowed to advertise to its users. It is not allowed to do so without their affirmative consent. The fourth category is search and web integration. The Windows search bar has, for years, defaulted to Bing when users search for terms that could be web queries. Typing the name of a local application can, depending on configuration, trigger a Bing search alongside the local results. European regulators have objected to this for multiple reasons. It sends user queries to Microsoft's servers without clear consent. It gives Microsoft's own search engine a structural advantage over competitors, and it mixes local and web results in ways users find confusing. The new directive requires that web search be clearly separated from local search, that users be given an explicit first-run prompt about whether to enable web results, and that the choice of default web search engine be user configurable without requiring third-party software. The fifth category is the default apps. For years, Windows has aggressively defaulted to its own browser, its own email client, its own photo viewer, its own video player, regardless of what the user might have installed. Changing the default browser in Windows has been, depending on the version, a multi-step nuisance. The directives now require a single-click default change. No friction, no nag screens asking the user to reconsider, no automatic reset after updates. And when you install an alternative browser, the installer must be able to set itself as default with the user's consent without requiring the user to navigate through Microsoft's Settings app. That is the scope. it is substantial. And from the European user's perspective, it is a meaningful improvement. Windows, for the first time in its history, will ship as an operating system that respects its users' privacy by default, not by configuration. But here's where the story gets interesting, because Microsoft has two choices. It can implement these changes only for European machines, maintaining the existing, more aggressive defaults everywhere else, or it can implement them globally. The legal obligation is only European. The question is which way Microsoft jumps. So far, based on public statements from Microsoft's European leadership, and based on technical previews shared with IT journalists in late March and early April 2026, Microsoft appears to be going the first route. European builds of Windows 11 will have the new defaults. American, Asian, African, and Latin American builds will not. Same operating system. Different behavior depending on where the machine is being used. This is the same pattern we saw with the GDPR and cookie consent banners. The GDPR applied to Europe. Websites could have served a different version of their site to European visitors. Most did. Some, like the Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune, simply blocked European IP addresses rather than comply. The interesting cases, though, are the ones that decided to comply globally, like Apple, which extended much of the GDPR's rights to all users regardless of location. Whether Microsoft does the Apple thing or the LA Times thing with Windows remains to be seen, but the early signals suggest it is going for the minimum region-locked implementation. Which raises a question that I think most American and non-European viewers should be thinking about. Why exactly does Microsoft treat European users as deserving of privacy defaults that other users do not get? The answer is straightforward. European regulators have the power and the will to enforce their rules. Other jurisdictions do not. In the United States, the Federal Trade Commission has limited authority over data collection practices, and the political appetite for data privacy legislation has been limited. Without legal teeth, Microsoft has no incentive to rein in the defaults that its business model benefits from. So it does not. And the split between European Windows and everything else Windows is effectively a map of where the law has been enforced and where it has not. This creates practical options for non-European users who want the European defaults. None of them are perfect. Option 1. You can manually configure your Windows installation to mirror the European settings. Microsoft's documentation, ironically, now includes clear guides on how to do this because European regulators required that Microsoft publish the exact settings that are changing. You can open Settings, Privacy and Security, and walk through each category. Diagnostic data, set to required only. Advertising ID, off. Suggested content, off. Cloud experience, disabled. This takes about 15 minutes. It closes most of the gap, though it does not give you the same legally binding protection that European users have, because Microsoft can, in future updates, choose to re-enable settings or add new telemetry that is not covered by your current configuration. Option 2. You can install a third-party tool that does this work for you. O and OShutUp 10, W10 Privacy, and PrivateZilla are three well-known open-source utilities that audit Windows privacy settings and let you configure them from a single interface. These tools have been around for years and are regularly updated to reflect Microsoft's latest telemetry changes. They do not do anything you could not do manually. They just make it faster and easier to keep track of. Option 3. You can run a version of Windows that ships by default with the European settings. Tiny11, a community-built, stripped-down version of Windows 11, has been around for a couple of years and removes most of the telemetry and bloat. Running a community build comes with its own trade-offs, including update reliability and security patch timing, so it is not for everyone. But for users who want a leaner, more private Windows without leaving the operating system, it is an option. Option 4, you can leave Windows. I mention this not as an evangelism move, but because it is, honestly, the option that more people will pick as the gap between European Windows and everywhere else Windows becomes more visible. Linux does not have a European version and a non-European version. Ubuntu, Fedora, Linux Mint, and every other major distribution respect user privacy by default globally because the developers building them have decided that privacy is the right default regardless of what local regulators require. That is a philosophical difference. It is why Linux tends to attract users who care about these issues to begin with. The broader point, and I want to make this carefully, is that the European Union is doing for Windows what Windows users would have done for themselves if they had the power. Europe has not invented new privacy requirements out of thin air. Europe has listened to what users have been asking for years and has translated those asks into law. The settings being defaulted off in Europe are the same settings that privacy-conscious users everywhere have been manually disabling. The difference is that now, in Europe, you do not have to know to disable them. They are off. This is what it looks like when consumer advocacy works. It is slow. It takes years. It requires a regulatory regime with both the authority and the political will to act. And it produces, at the end, an operating system that works for users more than it works against them. Everywhere that does not have that regulatory regime gets, by default, the version that works against them. There is a lesson here about the gap between what we are told markets will deliver and what markets actually deliver. For 20 years, the argument for unregulated software has been that competition will force companies to build what users want. That argument has been wrong in a very specific and observable way. Competition has not forced Microsoft to respect Windows users' privacy. What has forced it is Brussels. And Brussels is now writing the blueprint that, in my view, other jurisdictions will eventually copy, because the results are good, the cost to consumers are low, and the downside to Microsoft is manageable. If you are in a jurisdiction that does not have GDPR-style protections, your leverage over Microsoft is limited. You can write to your legislators. You can support advocacy groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and NOIB that push for stronger laws. You can vote with your installed operating system. You can, at minimum, manually configure your Windows machine to behave the way the European default now does. I'm going to be watching this story closely through the rest of 2026 and into 2027. The implementation deadlines are staggered. The first wave of changes goes live this summer. The deeper architectural changes, including the search separation and the default app handling, land later in the year. Microsoft's compliance has, so far, been grudging but functional. European regulators have, in my honest reading, the ability and the will to audit compliance and fine Microsoft if it cuts corners. So I expect this to land, and to land cleanly for European users. For the rest of us, the question is what we do with the information. Subscribe if you want the follow-up video that walks through, step by step, exactly how to configure a non-European Windows machine to match the new European defaults. That video is coming next week. And in the comments, let me know whether you think other jurisdictions are likely to follow Europe's lead, or whether you think this is the beginning of a permanent geographic split in what Windows even is. I read the comments, I learned from them, and the more we talk about this stuff, the harder it is for the defaults to stay where they are.